Frozen Music is a video series from ABB presenting unique building projects and the architects behind them to a global community. Follow us around the world.
Well, welcome back for the last in our presentations today of the winners in the Future Project, so WAF 2021. This is one of two winners in the culture category, and it's called Silo City in Buffalo, New York, in the United States, New York State that is, rather than the city, and it's by Studio V Architecture, and we're now going to hear the presentation, so please start.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm very excited to show this to you. I'm Jay Valgora. I'm the founder of Studio V. I begin with what makes us an architect. I was born in Buffalo, which I consider to be one of the greatest ruined cities in America. My father worked in the steel mills and my mother taught English. So this led to my two interests in abandoned industrial landscapes and their effect on community and culture. Buffalo has the largest collection of grain elevators in the world. This led to an incredible period of urban growth, and these are the examples that really redefined modern architecture. These are the grain elevators visited by Gropius, Mendelssohn, Le Corbusier that really influenced the whole course of modern architecture. Mumford talks about cities, the things we need to make them. They begin with the castle and the shrine. These are kinds of new citadels for cities with no walls, but really the granary and the development of the granary actually led to, in the grain elevators, the explosion of urban growth that occurred across the world. Today, these buildings lie in ruins. They're abandoned. These beautiful massive structures have incredible, almost limitless interior spaces. And so really, the question is, what could we do with them today? So this actually shows some footage of the surrounding area where you get a sense nature has started to take over the grain elevators. Their concrete forms are in contrast to the kind of greenery that has begun to overtake them as a series of gardens and ruins. The relationship of these great rooftops to the surrounding oceanic lake of Lake Erie really made them very, very incredible in terms of their relationship. And they were purchased by a man named Rick Smith, a very unusual man, a third generation entrepreneur. And he started to ask, how could he develop a vision for these to create something new, to bring them back? He's a musician, a dreamer, but he inherited a massive steelworks, and he asked us, how could we start to come up with a new idea for them? So I begin with something a little bit unusual, because unlike most architecture looking at future projects, we thought, how could we create something that is not one singular vision, but that constantly changes over time, like the grain elevators themselves? And so I reference in 1836, just 6 years before the grain elevator was invented, there were these wonderful paintings by Thomas Cole that were called, the Course of Empire. And they tell the story and the arc of change of architecture and how it can grow and civilizations and empires. And it's interesting to me because it creates almost this architecture of obsolescence. And Buffalo grew from a wilderness city to the grain elevators, which actually led to an explosion in growth. So I'm kind of paralleling the two series of paintings and showing the relationship between them over time, including how it led to the kind of end of the city. So my question is, how could this influence a future project for the grain elevators? Now, we had to document them. We had to go in with drones and interns. It's really an entire city of grain elevators. And we decided not to embrace just one design, but a series of concepts that would overlap four of them. The first is called Silo Ruins. The whole idea was that it would be a campus with greenery near the river, embracing the ruins, starting to restore the wounded landscape of the Anthropocene and start to engage and tie in with the community. We worked with a whole series of community volunteers to create a series of gardens, including places to gather, initial structures like the Lyceum and Duende, a bar, as well as doing things like occupying the ruins, providing tours. And so the next step is silo gardens. These overlap in a certain sense, where we started to create a series of gardens between the silos. And this is a future project because it's underway now, but the larger vision is only just beginning to be realized. And so this shows how we start to use bioremediation in order to reclaim native species. We start to showcase how the greenery has overtaken the grain elevators. And then we started to cultivate new gardens in and around them with tours to start to really develop it as a site where people could come in the future. Silo Passage is the third phase, where we're looking now at taking the elements at the rooftops, a series of conveyors, a series of connections, a series of abandoned bridges, and using them to make one passage that actually connects all of the different grain elevators and the surrounding mills. This idea is to really create links and connections with these former abandoned spaces, these conveyor spaces, these bridges in the sky that would actually link all of the different components and create a series of walkways capturing green roof gardens and extensions all the way through the entire complex. The last phase is Silo City, where we're actually looking at a greater vision for the entire community. Different types of architecture in the silo and the mill buildings led to different approaches. The silos themselves, we're looking at arts and cultural spaces. We're not really cutting windows in them. We wanted to actually make spaces that would preserve the integrity of the structure. But in the mill buildings, we could create a series of spaces that would actually support the arts and cultural uses. So we're looking for a great range of spaces. And we started to do performances, venues, operas, spoken word, different kinds of connections within them, leading to a larger vision for the entire complex where each of the individual buildings would have different program components that we would actually link together with a series of gardens and reconnect the waterfront with a whole series of different uses, reinventing the nature of arts and culture by carving out the volumes within the interior and using the mill buildings in between for more standard uses such as residential, affordable housing, artist housing, makerspace to support the more unusual spaces within the elevators themselves. The elevators is perhaps the most interesting part. Working with a brilliant structural engineer, we found we could carve out the volumes from the interior, top light these spaces. We're looking at a combination of galleries, museum spaces, gardens on the rooftop with a series of skylights, but also more shocking uses, such as the image on the right, where we're creating a vast natatorium, almost like ice cube trays, where we fill the silos full of water and do a series of cascading gardens and waterfalls, beautifully lit from above, from the tops of the silos to maintain the integrity of the structure. In other spaces, we can create galleries and art museums, large open spaces that can support different arts and cultural uses. And we're working both with local artists to do installations and spaces within here, but contacting institutions to see if we can combine unknown artists with those that are more famous. So as I begin to look at the end of it, it's not just one single vision, not just one idea that's fixed in time, but the notion is as a future project that this will constantly change, that the spirit of it is that it will never really be one single place, that we're not looking for a final product or a phased approach, but that it will always exist partially in ruins. It will always exist partially as finished buildings. It will always exist partially as gardens. And so I would finish with this brief film.
Silo City was the foundation of Buffalo's prosperity, but it isolated and disconnected this area.
The demise of the grain trade left Buffalo with a bunch of hulking titans of former wealth creation and a whole bunch of members of our community here without jobs.
And now we have this rare opportunity to take these ruins and use them as a vehicle to reconnect the surrounding community. Nature has begun to take over the site, and we enhance that with bioremediation projects that support the future growth of gardens and habitat.
Biodiversity is what makes a place resilient. This is the perfect gathering space where people can actually interact with the environment and not just as a spectator.
Occupying the ruins is part of the idea. We're going to create pathways and passages across every level of the buildings, gardens in the sky with views over the lake. But it also means making new links to the surrounding parks network. We're partnering with community leaders to create walkways from abandoned rail lines that currently divide the city. At the heart of this green network will be Silo City. The design for Silo City adapts the revolutionary structures into vast arts and cultural spaces with affordable housing, galleries, auditoriums, maker spaces. And like a city, it will never be complete. It grows from the people who use it. And when the city of Buffalo inevitably changes, Silo City is going to change with it.
So I'd very much like to thank the jury for considering this project and to say that in the end, Silo City is really a vision for the reinvention of cities, not just Buffalo, but for the industrial ruins of the 21st century, and how we can do something that will create a new return, a renewal of this kind of architecture for our children and those to follow. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Anko, would you like to start with this one?
Of course.
So honestly, I haven't really, I haven't got a sense of how you're looking at using the the structures themselves and kind of programmatically, apart from one of the references of the gallery. But I would assume it will take a lot more dimension in terms of programmatic planning to give life to these structures and actually bring them back into the urban fabric, given the complexity of the volume and the actual built mass of the industrial legacy. So
well, perhaps I can
if you can speak a little bit more about how you're looking at that. Yeah.
Sure. So what's very unusual about the collection of grain elevators in Buffalo is there are two structures and they're interwoven. They're the elevators themselves, as you see in this image, for example, the upper left, the American, where it's the grain elevators, the concrete silos, and immediately next to them are masonry structures that were mills and malt houses. This was partly due to the nature of the Erie Canal because it would be shut in the winter, and so they had to process the grain during the off season. So the reason this is interesting is in the larger complex, it leads to the idea that the silos are interspersed with brick structures. So we led to two program requirements. The silos themselves, which are so incredible and difficult to reuse, we decided to use purely for arts and cultural uses, as well as physical culture, body culture. So we're creating galleries, museums, exhibit spaces, performance spaces, but also a natatorium, a vast swimming pool, and a velodrome, a vast biking ring within it. The mill buildings, which are in between them, are far more conventional. They're really masonry structures, brick structures, in which we can put windows. And so for those buildings, we're doing housing, affordable housing, artist housing, maker spaces, creative commercial spaces, and a little bit of hospitality in some of the small scattered buildings and sheds in between, restaurants, cafes, bars. The whole thing is connected by a series of gardens that actually follow the original trail of the rail lines, as you can see here. They create these radiating patterns that link the buildings together. So hopefully that explains how the program responds directly to the kind of typologies of the architecture.
Right.
Mariana, do you have a reaction to this?
I love the idea of the invisibility of the project. It's just a ruin. I think Alvaro Siza and the Portuguese architects are discussing a lot the ruins from different ages, and I think the industrial heritage that we have now is not different from any other ruin we have already produced. And I think just zooming them slightly with the elevated pathways is a very elegant solution just to touch and activate and express your design rather than imposing new shapes or new forms of roofs into the existing buildings. I think it's a very elegant project to the edge of invisibility.
Alvaro Siza was actually my teacher. He was my teacher in graduate school, and he is a great influence on me. And it's an honor that you even mentioned him in connection with our project.
Peter.
What I like about this project is its sensibility. It almost stands out against many projects you see them having a sort of romantic view of such a place. I also know that Buffalo has an unusually high number of artists who have moved there because it's cheap to get large space, and so you're using the art connection is not a sort of bullshit. I think yes, I like the sensibility of it. I would probably like to see a little bit more particularization, a few more examples, but the ones that you do show make absolute sense. And I think the thing of, I've seen one or two converted silos, one or two quite famous ones, and mostly they involve too much sort of making holes and being rather optimistic about what you can do with the space. To say you will top light them and then use them as art spaces is a very sensible thing to do. And also the business of the greenery, the fact that wasteland can become garden. I mean, there have been various examples in Germany and elsewhere where old industrial flattened territory, you keep them as a kind of hybrid between being a park and a kind of memory place. I think I love the sensibility of it.
I can tell you it was interesting. We worked with a great engineer, Silman. I found the original drawings in a shed on the site where a homeless person was living who was kind of a caretaker for the project. It's really kind of a mythical project. And we found that the original reinforcement of the cylinders was so strong that they act as a kind of a lattice beam structure. So we found that the idea of carving out the spaces, as you can see in this drawing, was actually very efficient, incredibly efficient. And we checked it against the original structural drawings of the silos, which we found. To me, I worked also with Future Green, collaborated with me, a landscape firm, and they're very interested in the notion of the landscape in the Anthropocene. The idea that we can't restore an original landscape, but that it's fascinating that nature itself is overtaking this and in a sense remediating the site. And now we're working with actually bioremediation specialists to add on to what was happening naturally and to accentuate that and to build on the nature of the greenery, including incorporating it within and on top of the buildings themselves.
Yeah, and I think without being too corny, I think you really love the place. That comes through.
Yeah. And I think really to add on to that the use of the silos I find magnificent, but I also find the possibilities of other people doing things with them. So you might have an installation by a curator, a curated art exhibition, or you might have a site-specific commission for particular artists to do something with it, or you might have a concert, or you might have another sort of performance. All of that seems to me to be a really interesting stage set that talks about this extraordinary moment in history where grain production started to become really, really enormous, enough to allow significant numbers of people in the Western world, in Europe and North America, not to have to make their own food or grow their own food. So what it does is it has turbocharged the whole process of cultural evolution over the last 200 years or thereabouts. And I think to reinterpret the structures that were made for that period is fascinating and a real challenge, and promises, I think, to be have some really extraordinary outcomes.
It's funny. I'm writing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm writing a book on utopia now, and the fascinating thing to me is that this did turbocharge cities, and I'm wondering, and I'm building on what you said, if we can turbocharge the reinvention of our cities. Now that in a sense, modern architecture, I feel, regrettably almost tried to assassinate the city originally. And now, of course, the job of modern architecture, contemporary architecture, will be to save and preserve the city as our greatest means of education, wealth creation, promotion of equity. And so I find that taking these ruined buildings and finding a new way to employ them for those means, that's really the larger vision for the project, which I think speaks to what you were just describing.
Yes, absolutely. Anyone else have a comment about this project? Because I think it's quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't know if you have a figure for the volume of space those silos encloses, but it's huge.
I should actually figure it out in cubic volume. The overall scale of the project is probably about 100,000 square meters. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And who did the illustrations? Did you do it internally? Very, very nice illustrations. You're using the black and white smoky.
Thank you. We did them all with our own staff. So all of the illustrations, none of them are professional renderings. We do all of our own. We had a wonderful young person working for us, and we were sort of inspired by, I call it the rhino skin or the elephant skin of the elevators. We wanted that to influence the sort of graphic representation.
Super cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Thank you very much. And that concludes our presentations of the Future Project winners. Thank you to all the presenters, and a big thank you to our jury, Mariana Simas, Ankur Chokshi and Sir Peter Cook, who have been with us for the last few hours, I think adding some very significant and serious comments to a series of very interesting projects. We now have to pick a winner, and that will be announced in our general awards announcements, which start in just under 2 hours, I think, or just under 3 hours. It is just after 3:15 in the afternoon in London, and we're starting the awards announcements just after 6 o'clock in London, so it's in just under 3 hours. Hopefully you can all join us then to see who has won. And meanwhile, my fellow jurors and I, we have to consider all the ones we've seen and pick a winner. So thank you very much.